Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Screaming People by Robert Bloch. Chapter 1. It begins in darkness. They call it sleep, but it's only darkness. I lie there curled in the womb posture and the darkness is all around me. When sleep comes, I merely draw some of that darkness inside me, the warm, rich, all-encompassing darkness, the darkness that is the nourishing blood of the night. Womb posture. A fetus lacks awareness, but I know that I'm asleep. I like to sleep. Take it easy. Rest. Relax. Get plenty of sleep. That's what the doctors told me, and I'm willing to follow orders. Roxy tells me I'm lazy, but I don't care. Not if she lets me sleep. Not if she lets me go into the darkness, where I can be alone. I'm alone now. I don't even have to think about the necessity of sleep anymore. I'm safe. No one can get to me. Not even myself. Not even myself. That's very important somehow. I'm really alone, the way I want to be. Better than that. I can burrow so deeply down into the darkness that I lose myself completely. There is no me. There's nothing but night. Night and the voice. I have to call it that, although it really isn't a voice. I don't hear it, merely sense its presence. It exists suddenly, somewhere in the darkness around me. It emerges as a buzzing which I cannot locate in time or space. Does it impinge upon me from far away, or is it whispering beside my ear? It doesn't matter. The voice tells me that, and I realize this is true. It doesn't matter where the voice comes from. It's a part of the darkness. I need the darkness around me, so I must accept the voice. Then it grows. Maybe the voice feeds on darkness too, because it expands immediately until everything else is blotted out. Even the darkness is engulfed by the voice speaking to me, telling me what I must do if I want to go back into the dark. Get up, get dressed, go to Hexler's. I'm asleep. I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to go anywhere. And I've never heard of Hexler's, but the voice realizes all that. It understands, and it tells me I have to go. Get up, get dressed, go to Hexler's. Over and over again. I try to escape from it, into the darkness, but the darkness is gone now. There's only the voice telling me what I must do. In order to retreat into the safety of the dark again, I have to obey. There's no question of refusal. If I refuse, I'll stay here forever, listening to the voice, and I don't want to do that. So it's easier to do as I'm told. The voice will direct me. All I need do is listen and accept, and the voice will lead me back into the darkness. The voice knows the way. Everything is so simple. I'm not conscious of awakening, but I know. A part of me knows that I've left the bed. No need for lights. I can find my clothing in the dark, without even opening my eyes. I can dress in the dark, quickly and quietly. The voice anticipates everything. But where's the door? If I could only open my eyes. Very well. Open your eyes. That's better. I can go now. But where? Hexler's. Hexler's house. So it's a house. James P. Hexler. North Azure Drive. The voice will guide me. The voice will never fail because it knows. I can trust it. I must trust it. There's something familiar about the voice. His master's voice. Funny, that should come into my head. Records. I'm in the transcription game myself. Mustn't think about that, though. Must concentrate on what the voice is telling me. I'm getting instructions now. Walk quietly. I open the door, tiptoe into the hall, close the door behind me. The voice anticipates every movement. And then I'm out on the street, alone in the night. Alone, yet not alone, because the voice is with me. Turn west. The wind angers the grass. I gaze up at the ancient evil world of the moon. It radiates an orange aura of corruption. North, into the canyon. On steeply sloping hills, the trees bow and beckon before me. Huddled behind them, strange houses squat, blinded by night. Enter the 5th driveway. The hill is high, the path uncertain. Climb. Why couldn't I have come around the front, where the walk leads to a gate? Climb. I climb the hill, and then the wall is before me, the high stone wall ringing the hilltop. I pause, uncertain. Climb! My fingers claw, my knees lock, my back arches. But somehow there is no pain. The voice protects and directs. My forehead is wet, and an engine throbs in my chest. But I'm straddling the top of the wall, gazing down through the trees at the dark house on the hilltop. Jump! I float on the wind. The falling dream. My ankles are wrapped in cotton batting as I land. No, that's illusion. I must remember to be careful of illusions. I must remember that the voice alone is real. There is nothing but the voice and the will to obey it. Now I must walk towards the house, approaching it from the rear. I must stay within the shadows of the trees where the moon's rays are barred by branches. The house of stone is huge, a mansion, built in the days when men thought of such edifices as mansions. The myriad heads of its cupolas are grey, silvered by the touch of time and moonlight. Myriad heads in one body, a hydra house. Why do I think of that? I don't think in such terms. But the voice does. The voice is thinking for me. The night holds no secrets for the voice. All I need do is listen and obey. Look for the open window. Yes, look for the open window. Look for the silver lining. Look for the bluebird. That's my voice now, my thought. Or am I just remembering something that was already told to me a long time ago? A long time ago I was in bed, asleep. Maybe I'm still asleep. Maybe I'm just dreaming. The open window. The voice doesn't want me to wonder about such things. The voice is telling me that somewhere along this side of the house there is a window, open and waiting. Yes, I can see it. The sill is low. I can reach it, climb over it. That's what I'm supposed to do. And I must be quiet, exceedingly quiet. Yes, I hear. I know. But it's dark. If I had my lighter, no light. Of course, no light. I can stand here until my eyes grow accustomed to the dimness. Carrots for night vision. Night vision. A vision born of the night. Stand in the strange house now and try to see. There's a musty odor in this room, a museum smell. I stand quietly, breathe softly, because no one must know I'm here. I am a stranger, and afraid, in a house I never made. I blink at the sudden light. Is there somebody outside? No, it's only the moon shining through the trees as it rises. I can see now. The long room is like a museum hall lined with cases. I start down it. The voice guides me. Watch out for creaking floorboards. Don't bump against the glass. Breathe slowly, quietly. Behind the glass I see figurines, pottery, vases, horses. Chinese art. Ming, Sung, Han, Tang. I don't know my dynasties. Big Kuan Yin. Fu dogs. A hoti in the milky perfection of jade. That's valuable, the jade. Tao. Go to the stairs. The staircase is around the corner, in the outer hallway. There are other rooms opening off the hall, containing more glass cases. A fortune in the stuff. Hexler must be filthy rich. Move slowly. I must climb the stairs. They creak. So easy does it. One step at a time. And now where? The third door on the left. It's darker here in the upper hall, because all the doors are closed. 1, 2, 3. Here. Now open the door. Open it just a trifle, as the voice directs. There's moonlight streaming through the window and I can see. I'm standing in a bedroom, a vast bedroom. The high, canopied bed in the corner is 1,000,000 miles away. Its curtains waver slowly in the breeze from the open window, billowing back and forth like bat wings flapping in the dark. The bed is a huge beast, crouching over its prey. I walk silently, threading a path through the tables lining the long room. There are bell jars on the tables, with more jade beneath them. Jade and ebony and ivory. There's a jackal-headed figure beneath one jar. That would be Anubis, the opener of the way. Who opened the way for me? And what's that sound? I hear a tinkling in the moonlight, a faint clicking and clattering. Something is stirring in the breeze, the same breeze that ripples the short hairs rising along the nape of my neck. Now I see it, on the table next to the bed. There's a little silver skeleton, mounted on a pedestal. I stare at it, but there's no mistake. It's a perfectly fashioned miniature skeleton, completely articulated, a silver skeleton with ruby eyes. Hinged and jointed and hung from a hook rising out of the pedestal's base. No wonder it clicks and clatters, for the tiny figure is weaving with the wind, bobbing and grimacing in a dance of death. Death. I must get out of here. What am I doing? This is all wrong, I must. The window seat. Open the window seat. The voice commands, but I can't obey. I have to get away from this place. The window seat. Just open it and take the box. Then you can go. Yes. I could do that. I could do that very quickly. Nobody will see me. Those little red eyes are only rubies. I can take it, fast, and then I can run. The seat swings up. Funny, there was a lock here, I can see that. But it's broken now. I lift the seat, and here's the box. A black velvet box, long and shallow. I can hold it. I can hold it as I run down the hall. Go to the bed. I don't want to go to the bed. I want to run. I'm going to run. Except that I can't move. All at once I'm back there in the desert, pinned underneath the car, and my arms and legs are paralyzed, and I'm trying to get away from the pain in my head, trying to sink down into the darkness. That's why I need the darkness, still need it now, to get away from the memory and the pain. And the only way to find the darkness again is to let the voice guide me. I must follow the voice. That's the only way. Go to the bed. I put the black case down on the table and walk over to the bed. It won't hurt to look. Even if the bat wings flap, even if the tiny skeleton moves in its dance macabre, I can look. I can gaze through the parted curtains. The room is a museum, and I am staring down at a mummy. Gaunt, stiffened limbs wrapped in the folds of the bedding. A bald, shriveled skull. A face that is old and wrinkled and brown and dry. No bitumen seals the lips, so it cannot be a mummy. It must be a man. A very old man, sleeping in a canopy bed, sleeping the sleep of the aged, which is like death. His chest neither rises nor falls. His tongue is limp in his open mouth. I can hear nothing but the faint clattering of the little silver skeleton. There are deep pools of shadow covering the old man's eyes. I bend forward, peering into them. Surely there will be a ripple. The stone of my gaze must inevitably plumb those depths. No ripple, no movement. Now. The voice is not speaking to me. It is talking to my hands. They know what to do. It's so simple, and there's nothing to fear. Besides, the voice will leave me if I obey. Then I can run away. Then I can sleep. Then I can go back into the darkness where there is neither voice, nor dreams, nor memory of pain. I have to sleep. It's the only sure way. The only sure way to banish silver skeletons and yawning corridors and mummies, grinning up into endless darkness. Now. Besides, I won't be doing it. Only my hands. My restless, moving hands. Find a pillow. There is a pillow under the old man's head. There was a pillow. Now it is above his head, over his face. My hands hold it there until the eyes and the open mouth are blotted out. My hands press a whiteness into the darkness. No sound, no movement. My hands press and my wrists ache, but the voice wants to be sure, very sure. A century later, I turn away and pick up the black case from the table. The moonlight is dimming, and the darkness increases. All at once the voice is gone. There is only that insane jangling, that damnable clicking from the obscene little grotesque on the table. My hands put a stop to the mummy vision. I can end this torment too. I grasp the silver figure and hurl it to the floor. Let my feet put a stop to the skeleton spectre. It's good to feel it crunch and splinter beneath my heel. See, I can dance too now. There, it's done. And I'm alone in the dark, at last. I must grope my way out of the room, ever so slowly. I must creep down the stairs, out of the house, back through the strangeness of the silent streets. But the voice is gone, and I shall sleep once more. I turn at the doorway for a last look. Blur of moonlight, swirl of shadows, and in the center of the room the broken jumbled heap of tiny silver bones. Chapter 2. Somebody was poking me in the ribs. I opened my eyes. Then I knew it was all right because I was in bed, in my own apartment, with the sunlight streaming through the blinds. I was back in the world of morning, and bacon and eggs, and Roxy. Roxy was doing the poking, of course. Her slim arm extended from beneath the covers of the twin bed next to mine, as she jabbed the pointed painted nail of her index finger against my pajamas. I was wearing pajamas. How could that be? Had I undressed again, and... A quick glance to my right showed my clothing hung neatly over the back the way Roxy always hung it for me. My jacket wasn't there. It would be in the closet. Roxy put it on a hanger before we went to bed. Yes, of course, it had to be that way. Wake up! What's the matter? Husky voice. I could remember the way she used it when she sang. No control. But the fire came through. What's wrong with you, Steve? Another nightmare. Nightmare? You've been tossing and turning and groaning like I don't know what. She laughed. I had an awful time waking you up. She must have been pretty. That was no lady. That was something I ate. I sat up and grinned. It wasn't hard to do. Roxy was something to grin at. Something to whistle at, too. I never could understand what she saw in me, but there was no doubt about what I saw in her. She was a beautiful redhead. Repeat, beautiful. Because there are plenty of redheads per se, or per henna for that matter, but very few worthy of that much abused adjective. Generally speaking, every girl with orange hair or caramel-colored hair is by courtesy a redhead. But Roxy's hair, in ordinary light, was really red, and there was no accompanying dermatological disorder, no hint of freckles or blotches in the smooth skin. I reached over and took her in my arms. Not a bad deal, but she kept one eye on the clock. 36 seconds later she said, "Steve, time to get up. You'll be late." I made a face at the clock, but I got up. "Want me to fix breakfast, honey?" she called as I started shaving. "No, don't bother. I'll catch something downtown." I stared at my countenance in the mirror. There were sagging pouches under my eyes. And no wonder. That dream last night had been the worst. Worse than the reality of the night on the desert, the night I was pinned under the car, worse than the weeks that followed. I really ought to tell Roxy about the dream, but not now. This evening, perhaps, when I came home. Then we could talk. Right now the thing to do was to get down to the office. I had a job to hold, peddling 1-minute commercials, 20-second transcriptions, 30-second recordings for station breaks in a world of hard sell which had nothing to do with last night's fantasy of dancing death. So it was time to face today's reality. Out, damned spot announcement. I adjusted my tie, picked up my coat, slung it over my arm, kissed Roxy goodbye at the door, and made my exit. It wasn't until I was halfway down the stairs that I put my coat on, and I was actually striding through the foyer of the apartment lobby before I became conscious of the unaccustomed bulk inside the jacket. That's when I pulled out the long, shallow black velvet box. It was utterly empty, but utterly real. And that, of course, is when the nightmare began again. Not in darkness this time, but in broad daylight. The harsh, acrid, smog-obscured daylight of what, in Los Angeles, passes for reality. So I didn't go to the office after all. I phoned them from a public cubicle at the corner, and then I boarded a Sunset bus. That's right. A bus. Everybody drives in Louisiana, but I'm the lone exception, have been, ever since that night out on the desert when the car rolled over. Right now the car was rolling over again, and the little silver skeleton was jangling, and I wanted to run home to Roxy and bury myself in her arms. But you can't go home again, and you can't tell the woman you love that everything is a nightmare and she is only a part of it. You can't seek reality through a mother substitute. Dr. Wagram had made that perfectly clear, and that's why I had to go to him now. I took the 91 bus not far from Angel's Flight and rode past the new county buildings on Hill. All the while I kept a tight grip on that damned black velvet box because it was a part of reality now. I had to keep my grip on reality until I reached Dr. Wagram. He could explain things to me. There must be an explanation, and I wasn't going to start screaming right here in a public bus. And I forced myself to stare out at Los Angeles, though that didn't reassure me very much. For fantasy is reality out here. I gaped at a cordon of men who groped with canes against the searing sunlight as I passed the Braille Institute of America. I blinked while the weird figure in the Space Patrol helmet whizzed past on his police motorcycle. After the bus turned onto Sunset, I noted the headquarters of the National Judo Association and tried to picture what went on inside, with little success. No more than I obtained as I attempted to visualize how the TV dreams were being made in the studios at Sunset and Cahuenga. If anything, that bus ride was a continuation of Flight and Fugue. Why, I wondered, had they bothered to build a Disneyland out here when every street corner offered its own vista of escape? I turned my head to the left and saw Schwab's Pharmacy, turned it to the right and saw a Chinese pagoda towering high on the hillside, stared straight ahead at the palms of the Garden of Allah. And here was a midget roaring by, all alone in the enclosed immensity of an outsize Imperial. Following him came Irish McCalla, Sheena of the jungle, one of the tallest women in show business, crouched over the wheel of her tiny copper-colored Volkswagen. And now I climbed to the west along the gaudy improbabilities of Restaurant Row, that Japanese place, and Ciro's, and the Mocambo and Scandia, all utterly unreal here in the sunlight because they were asleep. Their painted faces and neon eyes closed against the glare of the day. Like vampires, they come alive only after dark, and maybe that's the secret. Maybe these strip restaurants are vampires. Or run for the benefit of vampires who venture forth only at night and who know the password and enter to drink blood from the crimson concealment of crystal goblets. And that would lend a certain sinister significance to the name of the street itself, Sunset Boulevard. Could there be any more appropriate designation for a thoroughfare peopled by the undead? I thought of some of the waxy, pallid faces I'd glimpsed in the night along this route. Thought of the feral, feverish eyes, the too bright, two crimson lips pulled back from the white and gleaming teeth. Thought of this army awaiting sunset on Sunset, awaiting it in crypts concealed beneath the big houses up there in the canyons. They were waiting now, waiting for the sun to fade before they awoke to walk and drink their fill in a world of mist and moonlight and silver skeletons. And then I was back in my nightmare again, and I thought of the big house on the hillside and the other big house I was searching for now. I left the bus just in time and started running up the slope of the hill to my left, and it was a nightmare. It was just the way it had been in my dream, only this time no voice prompted me. I knew where I was going and why, and I didn't stop until I rounded the turn on the private entryway and came to the stone arch on which was embedded the neat little bronze plaque reading Dr Wagram. I was sweating and panting, but I didn't slow down. I started to run along the drive towards the big doorway, and it was like running through water or something thicker. What is thicker than water? Blood. Yes, I was running through blood because everything was turning red. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it even through the black velvet of the box inside my jacket. And now it seemed as though I could hear other sounds too. There was the tinkling of tiny silver bones, and a harsh grating noise which seemed to come from far beneath the surface of the earth. It's hollow and empty down there in the crypts, and even the echoes are monstrously magnified when the coffin lids are opened from within and they come crawling out. They had heard my heart, and that's why they were coming to get me, because they knew it was pumping blood, and I was running through blood, and they thirsted. Blood is redder than Roxy's hair, and if you're blind and groping through the redness with a cane, you can't escape. Even judo won't save you when they wrap their cold arms around you and drag you down into the darkness. I could hear them coming closer and closer, and there was only one way to shut out the sound. I screamed. I screamed as I stumbled up the steps, screamed as I beat upon the door, screamed as I fell into Dr. Wagram's waiting arms. I was still screaming when he put me back in the womb. Chapter 3. It was very pleasant in the womb. I lay there for a long time, coiled up fatally. No, there was nothing to be afraid of here, and stark naked. Naked as a newborn babe, naked as an unborn babe, with only a gossamer covering of lanugo to protect it. But there was no need for protection because this was the womb. It was dark and it was red, and the walls were soft and moist and rubbery, and there was a faint and far-off murmuring which soothed and sated me. I wasn't afraid to think now, wasn't afraid to remember, although I didn't have too much to recall. Here I was, back in the womb, yet my actual memories didn't extend back past my 30th birthday. My 30th birthday. That was the night I'd rolled the car over. That was the night I'd been driving to Vegas. At least they surmised it had been my destination. For why else would I be racing across the desert in an open convertible with $4,000 in cash in the glove compartment? That's the amount they found when they found me. Or, rather, when he found me. For it was Dr. Wagram who, en route from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, pulled his car over to the side of the road and discovered me lying there in the ditch with half the convertible crushing my body. I'd suffered compound fractures of both arms and both legs. My skull had been smashed, and yet I was still able to scream. I must have been screaming for half an hour before he came along. Even now, even here in the womb, where nothing could harm me, I still didn't care to dwell on what happened. Actually, it all came to me via second-hand report, because when Wagram came I slipped down into the merciful oblivion of concussion-induced coma. And there I stayed for the next 10 days, while Wagram accompanied me to the nearest town, supervised the work of the doctor who put the casts on me, represented me in the police investigation which followed. And finally, after 2 surgeons flew out from Louisiana, examined my head injuries, and pronounced my condition hopeless, and my brain damage so extensive as to render the case inoperable, chartered a private plane and flew me back to his own clinic here. Then he operated. Dr. Wagram, who learned his neurosurgery in war-torn Munich. He put the plates into my skull and my head healed, and he grafted the skin and hair grew, and there was even a touch of cosmetological miracle involved. By the time my casts were off, my physical recovery was assured. This left me with but one problem: amnesia. Complete and total amnesia. Oh, I could comprehend consciousness, and I could even speak after a fashion. But I was unable to remember a single solitary moment of my life before that crash. Existence for me began with a scream of pain out there on the desert. My name? Stephen Edmondson, according to the driver's license and the registration of the crumpled car. My address, a motel just north of Venice in the Santa Monica area which I'd occupied for just 3 weeks. And it was during those 3 weeks that I'd obtained both my license and the automobile. I'd paid cash for the latter, and the dealer at the used car lot had a sketchy record and a vague recollection of my coming in and making the transaction. But that was all. The motel proprietor knew nothing about me except that I'd showed up one afternoon, wearing a nondescript outfit and carrying a single piece of luggage. I had paid him in cash too, and we had no further dealings except for my weekly settlement of the rent. Apparently I'd gone out, applied for a driver's license, took my tests, that was on record too, and bought the second-hand convertible. Meanwhile I'd lived quietly, unobtrusively, made no contacts and no friends. Dr. Wagram investigated, of course, and so did the police. They didn't have much to go on. When I drove out of the motel, I'd acquired new luggage and a complete new wardrobe, down to socks and handkerchiefs and underwear. They were able to find out where I'd bought some of it, but never learned what happened to my old clothing. Obviously, I'd discarded the lot. So they checked the military authorities, but there was no record of any Stephen Edmondson in service. And they checked with the FBI, and they put out the usual bulletins and inquiries, and tried to match fingerprints without results. No family claimed me, no friends stepped forward, no wife or children rushed to identify me. Nor was there any clue as to what I'd been doing holing up in a Venice motel with about $7,000 in cash, or what I'd intended to do with the $4,000 I had left when I took off in the general direction of Las Vegas. I couldn't remember. My mind couldn't remember, and my body couldn't remember. 30 years had been wiped out. At first, there was even the painful and embarrassing matter of relearning the simple physiological habit patterns governing ingestion and elimination. And after the casts were removed, the business of learning to walk again. I was like a child, more accurately, like a newborn infant. And that, I suppose, is why Dr. Wagram put me in the womb. I knew where Wagram picked up his neuropsychiatric techniques, but never did discover where he'd acquired his theories. And even after I'd regained a certain measure of comprehension, a certain vocabulary which extended my frame of reference, I was unable to obtain satisfaction in the matter. There's no point in explaining, Wagram told me. The short, plump, balding little man regarded me with enigmatic eyes. Poor Reich tried to explain about the orgone, and they laughed at him. Moreno's psychodrama techniques haven't won general acceptance. Even Jung has had trouble with his theories about the use of the mandala. The innovator, the unorthodox practitioner, had best be silent and let his work speak for itself in terms of results. I will say only this. Out of trauma comes fugue. Out of fugue comes the retreat to the womb. Many psychotherapists attempt to block this retreat. As the record attests, few succeed. So I have chosen another course. The analysand seeks the safety and comfort of the womb. Very well, I will give it to him. I have built a womb where he is safe and secure, where he can find rest and reassurance. When the time comes that life stirs anew within him, when he desires to be born again, he and I together will weave an umbilical cord of words, a cord of dependency which will be snapped only when the moment of psychic rebirth arrives. The orthodox analyst becomes a father image. I extend that. I become the mother image as well. And the womb serves. It has served others amongst my patients. It will serve you. And it did. Since that time I've heard it argued by reputable psychotherapists that the gaudy little room which Dr. Wagram set up as an artificial womb is a ridiculous concept, a charlatan conceit. But it worked. For me, it saved my life. It gave me a life, in place of the one I'd lost when memory melted away there in the desert. There came a time when I could talk again, when I could reason again, and when I could feel emotion. I never did manage to recover a knowledge of what had gone before. The past was not recaptured, and I learned to accept Thomas Wolfe's bitter dictum, "You can't go home again." But there were clues. Wagram may have been an unorthodox practitioner, but he didn't scorn the use of orthodox methodology when the situation indicated its employment. I took batteries of the usual tests, and Wagram probed with depth techniques, free association, and all the rest. There were clues in my reactions, indications of learned responses. Somewhere in my past I'd acquired the equivalent of a college education, plus a variety of motor and manual skills which reflected practical experience. Perhaps I'd been in the merchant marine for a while, though again a search of the records gave no confirmation. I'd lived in a colder climate for a time. I was familiar with the operation of a typewriter. I'd enjoyed sports. But all these things were haphazard inferences at best, and they afforded little reassurance. I couldn't stay in the womb forever, and I couldn't stay at Wagram's clinic forever. The time was coming when I must go back into the world, a world I never knew, and that didn't know me. I had no family, no friends, no ties of any sort. And I had no money either. The cash had gone, mainly to the doctors and the officials, and only a surprisingly small sum to Wagram, who refused to even entertain the notion of future indebtedness. In fact, he insisted that I take $600 with me when I left his place. "The data afforded me in connection with your case is invaluable," he told me. "I consider the time and effort spent on you to be a sound investment which will bring me ample returns in the future." Wagram was wonderful. It was he who found me a place to live, pulled strings to get me my first sales job. From that, after a few months of orientation, during which I kept coming back to him for reassurance whenever necessary, I finally stepped into my present position with the transcription agency. And that's where I'd met Roxy. She'd come in one day with an agent, a Ben Clermer. He was one of those hearty, gregarious boys, a tactile tactician, continually patting you on the back, holding your arm while he talked to you. He poured every woman he met. It was a compulsion, really. He couldn't help putting his hands on you, digging you in the ribs, going through all the motions employed by a successful pickpocket. But I don't like pickpockets, and I didn't much care for Ben Clermer, particularly when I saw him pouring Roxy. That's when I knew I was falling in love with her, when I began to resent his familiarity. They came in several times. Roxy was hoping to get a job belting out singing commercials. Unfortunately, she didn't have the voice for it. Those husky, untrained tones just didn't lend themselves to cooing over the delights of a liquid detergent. And she lacked the disciplined projection necessary for a career as a straight singer. Roxy had, I learned, knocked around the fringes of showbiz for a number of years. She'd been a nightary Corinne in her teens, done bits in Straw Hat Stock, even had a season as assistant to a carny magician. She'd started out at 15 as a beautiful redhead, and she ended up, at 23, as a beautiful redhead. Somewhere along the line there had been a brief, unsuccessful marriage and any number of brief, unsuccessful liaisons. I never asked her about the past. I'd learned to be pretty sensitive myself about this. But I did, eventually, broach the matter of her future. "I don't know what Clermer has told you," I said, "but I can imagine. He keeps giving you the build-up, doesn't he?" Well, in a way, I don't blame him. You can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. "That's a left-handed compliment if I ever heard one," Roxy answered. "I'm a left-handed guy, and right now I'm not interested in feeding you compliments. I want to give you a taste of the truth, which is, you can't sing. You dance well enough for the second line, but in another couple of years you'll be too old for chorus work. Your speaking voice is fair, but you'd need a lot of training if you ever hope to make it in radio or TV as an actress. It would take time and money, and let's face it, you haven't too much of either." "What are you suggesting then?" she asked me. "Could be you're out shilling for some business college." "That's a possibility," I said. "But frankly, It hadn't occurred to me. I was going to give you a bit of more obvious advice. The same advice you get from your mirror every morning, which is, get married. She made a face. Clemmer's already married. He's not the only man in the world. I know, but a girl has to wait until she's asked. Consider yourself asked then. Steve, I make $125 a week here average, sometimes up to $150 if the commissions go good and the residuals pay off. I don't have anything much put aside in the bank, but I've no obligations either. No family, no other responsibilities. We could find an apartment. You wouldn't have to just sit around all day, you know. Suppose you did want to take a little coaching, learn a bit about acting. There'd be the time and the money for that. And when you're set, I could see about making some contacts for you. I may not be an agent, but I've got a few connections in the field. How does that sound to you? Pretty good, as far as it goes. But there's one little part you left out. Something about love. And Roxy, I said that part then, with my arms around her. Said it and meant it and felt it. And I hadn't stopped saying it and meaning it and feeling it during the past year we'd been together. Of course I'd asked Dr. Wagram first. We had a long talk about marriage and its risks, particularly as they might apply to someone in my rather unusual position and circumstances. He hadn't been too encouraging, but I didn't need encouragement at the time. I needed Roxy, and for a while she took the place of any continuing therapy. It wasn't for many months that I went back to Dr. Wagram's clinic. When I went, Roxy wasn't involved. In fact, she didn't even know. She had met Wagram, of course, once or twice during the early months of our marriage. I told her a bit about my past, or lack of one rather, and of what Wagram had done for me. She hadn't pried or probed, merely accepted my story as she accepted me, and as I accepted her. For my own part, I never spoke to her of her earlier years. Even though she could remember them, I sensed that there was much unhappiness in that area. And I avoided it, just as I avoided my own earliest memories of lying under that car and screaming my mind away into the echoing night. The trouble was, I couldn't avoid such recurrent recall completely, not even in Roxy's arms. And so the time came when I went back to Wagram, and even to the womb. I did a little reading about amnesia, and what I learned bothered me. There must be something I'm afraid to face, something pretty awful, I told him. Surely by this time I should have a gradual return of memory. Partial recollection ought to be triggered in at least. Couldn't you try some more word association techniques? What about hypnoanalysis, narco-hypnosis, or... Wagram waved my suggestions aside. He was never a violent man, always a quiet one, but his mere casualness carried weight. I've not found it necessary to discuss my other work here at the clinic, Steve, he told me. The work which supports all of my research, all of my independent investigations, my staff. You met Dr. Bittner, of course, and Dr. Corelli. But did you know that I have 4 more internists on the payroll and 3 full-time nurses? Do you realize that at no time are there less than a dozen patients here, plus the analysands I see regularly by appointment? Well, it's true. This is a big house, Steve. Big and soundproofed. You've never been on the soundproof side, have you? And I've no intention of taking you there now. You wouldn't want to meet the screaming people. Screaming people? Wagram shrugged. Not a very flattering description, but a most accurate one. You see, that is the chief source of my livelihood here. The screaming people. The so-called incurables, the hopelessly psychotic. I've specialized in their care since I came here to the coast after the war. I've deliberately taken on the cases which were given up as hopeless. The men and women whose only remaining alternatives are confinement in a public or a private institution for life. To be utterly blunt, they are given a choice, including a private institution like this, only if they or their families have a great deal of money. I need a great deal of money in order to advance my own therapeutic techniques, and I've had no compunctions about obtaining it from them. Because, in return, I've been able to stop the screaming. You've cured the incurables? Dr. Wagram shrugged again. Remember what the doctors decided in your case? You were to die. But neurosurgery. Yes, I admitted. Neurosurgery. You saved me. But with physical techniques, here in your own operating room. What can you do for the psychotics? I can do what all the others do, Wagram answered. I can give them what you're asking me to give you now. Free association, depth analysis, narco-hypnotic sessions. But these people are beyond the scope of such treatment. Their only hope lies in drastic therapy, new techniques. I have evolved many. The womb here is one. Another is my sadomasochistic amphitheater, where acts of violent aggression can be carried out upon the persons of lifelike, even partially animated mannequins. Sexual repressions can be similarly discharged, but I've no intention of giving a lecture. It is enough for me to say that in most instances, something even more extreme is required. Here, let me put it this way, I will simplify, even oversimplify. The source of aberration lies in the past. The past lies in the memory banks. Eliminate the memory banks and you eliminate the source of aberration. There is no trauma, no guilt, no compulsion. When you remove the past, when you excise it surgically, completely. The brain has often been compared to a sponge, and so it is. Squeeze this grey sponge, squeeze it dry of all unpleasant memories of the past, and it can be filled again. I've learned how to drain the memories, using my own surgical techniques. Call it a combination of lobotomy, tepectomy, and advanced shock therapy. Exercised with sufficient skill to avoid permanent damage to the tissue. There will be papers published someday when my findings are sufficiently comprehensive, and I assure you that your own case will be much more than a mere footnote. Meanwhile, the work goes on. I remember my reaction to Wagram's words. So that's it, I said. You actually induce amnesia, deliberately and artificially erase all memory patterns. Not in your case, he told me. It wasn't necessary, any more than it was necessary during the war when I first began to study and specialize in mnemonic disorders. But I have learned how to duplicate general as well as retrograde amnesia without risk of amnesia or physical lesion. And that's what I've done for my screaming people. In effect, I reduce them to the prenatal stage and put them back in the womb. Then, very slowly, with the help of the staff working under my direction and with my prescribed techniques, I allow them to be born again, to become infants, little children, to learn once more how to walk and feed themselves and control bodily functions. I teach them to talk, to think, guide them through childhood and adolescence to full maturity. All this, of course, with a careful avoidance of traumatic incident, and naturally, in a comparatively short time. The autonomous nervous system responds quickly, relearning and readapting previous patterns of behavior. In some cases, a year or two is necessary for complete re-education. In others, I've seen miracles accomplished in 8 or 10 months. But don't you get zombies, robots? Not when the process is accompanied by selective memory restoration. When these people are ready for it, I begin the process of reorientation. That is to say, I feed them data based on their actual past life. With the help of family and friends, I can quickly and effectively recreate the sense of continuity based on a factual awareness of previous existence, but without the stress and tensions dramatized by Freud in his concept of ID and ego and superego. I give them back their past without fear and guilt, without the screams. You couldn't give me back mine. No, for I didn't induce the condition, merely corrected the concussion. But it doesn't matter really, does it? Not as long as you're satisfied with the present. I agreed with him then and let the matter drop. And whenever I had problems, daily tension, nightly dreams, I went back to Wagram and talked it out. When Roxy started taking lessons and private coaching, when she began getting a few walk-on or one-line bits in TV shows, when I started branching out at the transcription agency, I kept Wagram informed. Somehow our relationship was never on a social plane, but Wagram remained an important part of my existence. He was, in a way, my only link with the mysterious past, and I suppose I kept going there from time to time, with the hope that sooner or later he could guide me back and help me to fully establish my identity. Always, of course, when I brought the matter up directly, he repeated his dictum. The past doesn't matter as long as you're satisfied with the present. And always I'd been able to reconcile myself to this statement. Always. Until now, when I was writhing and screaming in the womb, remembering last night. After a time I was able to talk rationally about it, and he made me go over it again and again and asked many pertinent questions. It's beginning to sound a bit like last week's episode, he told me, when at last I emerged from the red chamber and donned my clothes once again. Remember, you came to me with the story of your dream? Something about firing a rifle on a target range covered with snow. I told you then what must be happening. Your buried memories, the suppressed content, attempt to break through to the conscious level in symbolic form. All that is necessary is to realize this. Of course, if one likes, one can examine these symbols and arrive at an interpretation. For example, in this dream of yours last night, there's the skeleton, the smothering attempt, "But last night was different," I exclaimed. "It wasn't a dream. Look, here's the black velvet case. It was in my jacket pocket this morning. Couldn't it have been there last night as well?" Dr. Wagram leaned back in his chair and stared at me across the desk. "Are you sure it isn't your wife's property?" "I don't recall seeing her with such a case," I told him. "Besides, you're forgetting the most important thing, that voice." "I haven't forgotten, but at the moment this doesn't concern me. What concerns me is what you have forgotten. Frankly, Steve, there must be another explanation as to how you came into possession of this object. There's something you don't want to remember. A limited retrograde amnesic condition has been established, a purposeful occlusion that, please, don't fob me off with labels. I've got to find out what this is all about. Can't you see it's driving me crazy? I don't like that word, Steve. I don't like it either. I don't like to go to bed and hear strange commands and have nightmares that seem real. A little more of this, and I'll end up like your screaming people." Wagram leaned forward, pursing his lips. "Steve, I'll be frank. You may not be too far wrong. I still feel I did an efficient job on you, surgically, but now I'm not so sure I did what was necessary psychically. Perhaps that's the next step. Maybe I ought to erase the past entirely. Erase the dreams, erase the tension, give you a whole fresh start." "You mean to operate again? The way you do on these rich psychos of yours?" "An operation, as you call it, would be unnecessary. I have certain shock therapy techniques that would work quickly and easily." "To make me forget all this?" I stood up. "But then I'd forget Roxy. You could learn again. The others do." "No. I'm not asking for a decision now. Don't try to make one. Think about it. Discuss it with your wife. Come to think of it, there's no reason why she should be excluded. This is as much her problem now as it is yours. Perhaps you ought to have confided in her fully before. I might have been mistaken in urging you to keep the whole truth from her. Why don't we arrange to get together, the three of us, some day next week, and go over the entire matter? I won't try to deceive you, Steve. This dream of yours disturbs me because of its latent symbolic content. It disturbs me because I still don't think it was a dream." I stood up, brushing past his desk. My arm swung out, dislodging the folded copy of the afternoon newspaper. I stooped, picked it up. My eyes scanned the headlines, halted at a routine little paragraph at the bottom of the front page. "What are you reading?" Wagram asked. "Here," I said, extending the paper and moving towards the door. "You read it. Maybe you'll find it interesting." He took the paper from my hand, but I didn't wait. I walked out of there, then started to run. Somehow I couldn't face what would happen when he read what I had just read. The little paragraph about the death, last night, of James P. Hexler, retired industrialist and art collector who had been robbed of a fortune in uncut emeralds and smothered with a pillow in his own bed at Azure Drive. Chapter 4. Police. I had to go to the police. I knew that, but this isn't what made me run all the way down to Sunset Strip. Sooner or later I'd go to them, or they'd come to me. Right now, I must see Roxy first. I must see her and tell her what had happened. Roxy would know how to help. Suddenly I realized the truth. Roxy was more important to me than Dr. Wagram. He had failed me just now. He hadn't been able to comprehend the facts, and so he hadn't been able to help. Roxy had never been given a chance to help. I owed her that. And I owed myself that too, because I couldn't conceive of how or why I'd kill a perfect stranger. And I had to know before the police stepped in. So I hailed a cab in front of the Bank of America and gave him the apartment address. And I sat forward on the edge of the seat as we hit the freeway, hit the afternoon tangle of traffic, veered off to the south, skidded down into the smog once more. That damned black velvet box was still in my jacket. The empty box. Where were the emeralds? Yes, and where was the voice? For that matter, where was 100% Azure Drive? Surely nowhere near my apartment, but I had walked there last night. Walked there and stolen and killed. I had no answers. Wagram had no answers. Maybe Roxy had some answers. Roxy could save me. We pulled up before the apartment and I was out of the cab before it ground to a stop, pushing a bill into the driver's hand and brushing aside the change. Then I was running up the stairs, fumbling in my pocket for the key. The key. Where was it? I searched in my trousers, my jacket. Had I forgotten to take my key this morning? Well, no matter now. If Roxy was home, she'd let me in. Roxy was home. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, then halted, just in time to avoid stumbling over her overnight bag. It rested right in the doorway, and next to it, on the floor, was her purse. "Roxy," I murmured. There was a faint sound from the bedroom beyond. I crossed the room in 3 strides. She was on the bed, and he was bending over her, his hands coiled in her long red hair. He had wound her hair about her throat, and now he was pulling the ends tight, strangling her in a scarlet noose. Her face was mottled and purple. His face I couldn't see, didn't wait to see. I jumped him from behind and pulled him off, and then I tore the heavy bed lamp from its socket and I smashed his skull, smashed and battered at the top of his head until he slumped to the floor and I could stare down into his unconscious face. At first I didn't recognize it. Hadn't expected to recognize it, of course. And then, beneath the pallor of that contorted countenance, a familiar expression emerged. The man had aged. His hair was graying. There was no pan makeup on the face. But I could still identify it. "Bucky Dugan," I murmured. "Bucky Dugan." Yes, I remembered him now. He used to be on the network, MC of one of those quiz shows, until the scandals broke last year. Then he disappeared. Things began to click into place now. Click, click, click. A tinkling sound, like the rattle of little silver bones jangling in the night wind. I stooped and searched his pockets, knowing what I'd find. My key, of course. And the rough objects the size of robin's eggs. They were grimy and encrusted, but as I turned them the light caught a hint of green flame. Roxy lay back on the bed, breathing stertorously. But she still breathed, and that was all I needed to know. I could call the police now. They'd send an ambulance over, take care of her. I made the call hastily, and hung up when they asked my name. It would have been fine if I could have stayed with her until they arrived, but there wasn't time. And it wasn't safe, not with the unconscious man on the floor and that other man. The dead man, discovered out there in the big house on Azure Drive. So I left, hastily, running down the street until I found another cab. Then I made the driver wait while I located my address book and found the name I sought. I gave him a number out on the strip. Funny that I should be retracing my route again. But then it was all very funny, all very coincidental, until one stopped to think, stopped to realize that there was no coincidence involved at all. This time we drove back through dusk, and the lights began to blaze up, the enchanted lights of an enchanted city. The wonderful lights of a world of magic, blazing forth from all of those wonderful magic clip joints and gay bars and mortuaries, which make up the romantic spectacle of Hollywood by night. The vampires would be abroad now. The bloodsuckers. And there was one bloodsucker in particular whom I was seeking. We came to the building. One of those two-story layouts divided up into small cubicles where little men spend their days barking into their telephones. Where the air is filled with stale cigar smoke and the endless babble of darling, sweetheart, lover boy, let's get together for lunch, let's make a deal, let's sign quick before they change their minds. I didn't know if I'd find him there this late, or if I'd have to seek him out at the Vine Street Derby, or Barney's Beanery, or even Taylor the Cock. But I was past caring. If I had to track him all over town, I'd catch up with him eventually. And when I did, I knew what I was going to do. As it turned out, he was in his office and alone. So I merely had to walk in, close the door behind me, march over to the desk, reach down, and grab him by the throat. I squeezed hard, but not too hard. That was the only difficult part, really, remembering that I mustn't kill him. Not yet, anyway. And then I stared down into his crumpled face and said, "All right, Clermer, let's have the straight story. Who paid you to bring Roxy to me in the first place? Who paid you, and how much?" He talked then. It was all bluff and bluster at first, and I had to slap him around a bit before he realized that I meant business. Once he made a break for his desk drawer, but he never got his hand on the gun. In a way that was all to the good, because I took the gun myself. And after that, everything was much easier, only it wasn't easy to hear what he had to tell me. It wasn't easy to hear the truth, even though I expected and anticipated most of what he had to say. Nothing was easy until I came to leave, until I marched out of there and started walking north, into the canyon, with the gun cocked and ready in my pocket. Nothing was easy until I came to Wagram's place. Chapter 5. The night was deeper here in the canyon. The private driveway held a private darkness, and there were no lights in the big house beyond. The screaming people were asleep, and I had no desire to wake them. Let them slumber in their wombs, their tombs, their dooms. Let them rest. Let them rot in the lair of the womb faker, the tomb breaker, the doom maker. Dr. Wagram. I read his name etched in bronze. I saw his name etched in blood, emblazoned on a bleeding brain. The door was locked. I didn't care. I knew other ways of entry, case entry, window entry, breaking and entering. There was no voice to guide me here, but I didn't need one now. I knew how to walk in the dark, how to stalk in the dark, how to simulate the silence of a shadow flitting down the long hall on the soundproofed side of the building. The soundproofed side. That's where the screaming people were. I could detect the dim light issuing from beneath the door on my left. I wasn't afraid. I had Clermer's gun. I edged up to the door, turned the knob slowly. The door opened. The wide room was bathed in twilight from recessed indirect fixtures set in the walls. And it was lined with low cribs that looked like beds, yet bore a mocking resemblance to still another place of slumber. Eternal slumber. As I gazed down into the cold countenances of the occupants, the resemblance heightened. These were not beds. They were coffins, and they contained corpses. There were no screaming people here. The mouths were closed in thin-lipped lines. The faces were slack, the eyes glazed. I saw a dozen coffin-like cubicles. 10 were occupied. I glanced at the faces through a tangle of apparatus overhead. then recognized the mundane instruments and installations used in ordinary intravenous feeding. They weren't really dead, but merely sleeping, or in a coma rather, for my presence did not awaken them. I gazed into their frozen features, then froze myself. Two faces I recognized, two I knew. "Bittner," I murmured. "Corelli." "Yes, Dr. Bittner. And Dr. Corelli, Wagram's own assistants. He'd said they helped him with the screaming people, and yet they were lying here with the others. And the others did not scream. I was the one who wanted to scream. But I held the gun, and I held my purpose, and I held my course. I moved towards the door at the far side of the room. Wagram's private quarters must be beyond. Yes, there was light flooding forth from under this door too. I approached the panel slowly, cautiously. Gently, I eased the door ajar. Now I could see into the room ahead. Wagram's private study, as I'd suspected, and I could see the back of his head over the top of the big armchair, see the front of his head as he swiveled and turned, see the look in his eyes as he recognized me, see the slackness of his mouth as he goggled at the gun in my hand. "That's right," I said softly. "Don't try to get up. In fact, I wouldn't advise you to attempt to move at all. Steve, I know it's a surprise. You were expecting Bucky Dugan, weren't you? Aye, let me do the talking. There are a few things I'd like to get straight before I call the police." He started to say something, but I waved him into silence. The gun was much better than a magic wand. I could perform some really amazing transformations with that gun, and he knew it, because he slumped back in his chair and listened. "I've never cared for the usual denouement," I said softly. "You know the bit, where the murderer holds a gun on the detective and blurts out a complete explanation of his crimes just before the cops break in and rescue his intended victims. Fortunately, the situation is reversed now, so let me tell it my way. All I want from you is confirmation or correction. Steve, you're not well. You need help. I've had your kind of help," I told him, "all I ever want of it. And at the time, I was grateful. Grateful that you came along, opportunely, to rescue me and save my life. Now I wonder if I wouldn't have been better off if I'd died out there on the desert. At least I wouldn't have served as your guinea pig. Because that's what I was, wasn't I? You experimented on me, using my genuine amnesia as a base on which to superimpose an artificial personality pattern. I was the first, wasn't I?" I waited, waving the gun, until he nodded reluctantly. "That's what I thought. Once you saw how easily it was possible to control an amnesic, you applied similar techniques with your so-called screaming people. The hopeless cases, whom only wealth saved from permanent public institutionalization, people whose families wanted to avoid publicity and who were willing to consent to anything which might seemingly restore the sanity of their loved ones. You had sent me back into the world, and you were able to send them back, when and if you so desired. My memory was lost in the accident. Their memories you erased with shock treatments. Is that the story?" "Yes." Wagram sighed the word. I raised the gun. "That's the story," I said, "but not the truth. I'm no neurologist, but I do know that the actual source of memory patterns has never been definitely located in the human brain. You can't deliberately erase memory, as you claim, without irreparable damage to actual cellular tissue and structure. Many external physical agents can bring about temporary amnesia, partial or complete. But unless there's widespread permanent deterioration, memory returns. You can't do what you claim to have done, physiologically. So your erasure must have been accomplished psychologically instead. In my case, and in the case of all the poor victims of your advanced therapy, you seized upon a temporary lapse in orientation and recall and made it permanent. And there's just one way in which you or anyone else could do this, through suggestion, through hypnosis. You installed those permanent memory blocks yourself, did so deliberately." "All right," Wagram said. "I'll admit that, but there was a reason. I've already explained it to you. By suppressing the memories, I could suppress the sources of psychosis and prevent any recurrence of aberration. That was the theory, the basis of my techniques. Perhaps it was, originally. But then you found that your hypnotherapy, administered to stunned and literally infantile personalities, gave you complete and utter control over your patients. You could actually order their present and future existences as you willed. And the temptation was too great, wasn't it? You began to think about ways of using that power, of what it would be like to send supposedly cured patients back into the world who were actually under your eternal command. You could install a series of hypnotic controls, ensure just the reactions you desired. Oh, it wasn't quite that simple, I realized that. It wasn't just a matter of sitting at some sort of psychic switchboard and pressing buttons at will, or being able to hold all the tangled strings and making the puppets dance. You needed other help, and you got it. Clermer told you this? Wagram murmured. He told me enough, so that I can guess the rest. I know about last night, for example. You were planning to take a big step forward, weren't you? If I'd succeeded as you intended, then you'd set up other similar tasks for the rest of your screaming people. You thought you'd found a way of committing the so-called perfect crime. Somehow you learned of Hexler's emeralds, perhaps through some relative who might have been a patient of yours. You made it your business to gain access to his home, to case the joint and familiarize yourself with the physical layout and with his personal habits. Then you sent me there to kill him and to steal the stones. But something went wrong. It took you a while to figure out what had happened. Today, when I showed up here at noon, you realized what must have occurred. So while you kept me occupied and we talked, you got the key to my apartment. While I was in that womb of yours, you gave the key to Bucky Dugan. He was one of your patients, one of your screaming people, had been ever since he cracked up after the quiz show mess. You went into that charming little morgue of yours, where you keep your wonderful cures in hypnotic trance, and you fed Bucky Dugan full of subliminal suggestion, then sent him out to kill. And again something went wrong, because I showed up in time to forestall him. She isn't dead, Wagram. He stood up then. His eyes never left the muzzle of the gun, but he stood up anyway. The police. She'll talk. It doesn't matter. I'm going to talk too. Wagram shook his head. No, you're wrong. You won't talk. He took a step forward. You won't talk, and you won't shoot me either. Because you can't, you know. My finger tightened on the trigger. I wouldn't risk it if I were you, I muttered. There's no risk involved. He was just a grotesque, bald-headed little fat man, and there was nothing imposing, nothing menacing about his appearance. But all at once, I wasn't seeing him anymore. I was hearing him. I was listening to his voice as it changed, as it became the voice. Yes, you were right, Steve. I do use hypnotic controls. I have used them to suppress your latent memories. I have used them to install commands, and you obeyed. Remember last night, Steve? You obeyed me then, just as you obey me now, because you must obey. You know that, don't you? You must always obey. Unless you listen to me, you'll go back. Back to the pain, forever. Do you understand? Back to the pain, forever. I can do that, you know. I can send you there forever. Send you to the time when you were crushed under the car, screaming your life away. You don't want to scream again, do you, Steve? You don't want to scream always and always, the way you feel like screaming now. It's more than anyone can bear, isn't it? The agony inside your skull. You're lying under the car, you can't move, you can't possibly move or get away from the pain. It's crushing you, Steve. You've got to make it stop. And it was crushing me, and I couldn't see Wagram anymore. I couldn't see the room, because it was dark here on the desert, and I was trapped under 2 tons of steel, and the pain was all around me, and I wanted to scream, had to scream. Don't, said the voice. There's another way. The only way. Just hold out your hand. There. Hold it out. Give me the gun, Steve. You don't need the gun, do you? That's right. Just give me the gun. It's the gun that is hurting you. Once you get rid of it, you won't feel the pain. There will be no more pain. Just darkness. Darkness and peace. You will rest then. Rest and forget. Forget that any of this ever happened. It was just a bad dream. A bad dream. Give me the gun. And I was out there in the darkness on the desert, but 1,000,000 miles away was the end of my hand. And I was holding it out to him, and he was taking the gun, and I could feel the pain flowing down my arm. How slowly the pain flows when it has 1,000,000 miles to go, and into the gun that he was taking, and in a moment I would be free and the pain would be gone, and the voice would be gone, and there would be nothing but the rapture of release. The voice told me that I believed the voice. I obeyed the voice, and then the voice stopped. The voice stopped, and I opened my eyes. I was back in Wagram's study, and I was staring at him and wondering what had happened to the voice. Wagram stood there, the gun dangling between his fingers. He let it fall and raised his hand to his throat, fumbling at the shiny object which quivered there in the space between his wide collar and his pudgy chin. The light glittered on the length of the vibrating knife blade. It glittered on the redness which gathered and gushed forth from the spot where the tip had penetrated his veined neck. He took a half-step forward and opened his mouth, but no voice came forth, only a thin trickle of pinkish foam. He stared at the blade of the scalpel lodged in his throat, then fell and lay silent. Silent and forever still. I turned. Roxy stood in the doorway. "Just in time," she whispered. "I must have come to right after you left. I knew you'd head straight for here, so I followed, before the police arrived. I found the scalpel out there, in the other room, where those creatures are sleeping. And I heard you and Wagram talking, heard what he told you there at the last. Oh, Steve, I'm so glad I got here before he." She started forward, but I ignored her. I stooped and picked up the gun. "I'm not glad," I said softly. "I'm sorry. Very sorry. You should have kept running, Roxy. Even without the emeralds, you should have kept running while you had the chance." "Steve, no, don't come any closer." I had the gun now, held it steadily. "You see, there's just one thing wrong with your reasoning. I didn't head straight for here after I left the apartment. I made a stop first. Out on the strip, I saw your friend Clerma. Drained white, the pallor of her face was indescribably lovely when framed by that long red hair. Or should I say Wagram's friend Clerma?" I continued. He must have been Wagram's friend first. "Because it was Wagram who came to him originally and asked him to introduce you to me." "No, that's not true. I don't know what Clerma told you, but he lied." I shook my head. "I'm willing to believe him," I answered. "Because it all fits." My voice softened. "I think I understand, Roxy. I can see how it was. You were just one of those good-looking women who never quite managed to make the grade. The breaks hadn't come your way, and you were getting just a little panicky about the future. Maybe you'd have to choose between marrying some bartender or taking the B-girl route. Then Wagram came along with his proposition. Clerma was to introduce you to me, you'd make your play, we'd get married. That would give Wagram what he needed to continue his experiments. A go-between, a liaison agent, someone who could help him to keep control. In return, he'd cut you in on his future profits. Because he told you his plans, didn't he, Roxy? He told you that he intended to use me as a sort of zombie, in robbery and murder. And you agreed. But it didn't work out that way," Roxy murmured. "I loved you, Steve. Yes, you loved me, and you loved living in a crummy little apartment and taking cheap bit parts when you could get them. But all the while you loved money more, and Wagram kept building me up, waiting for the right proposition to come along. When he planned this Hexler affair, he thought he had it in the bag. Only that's when you got smart." Roxy closed her eyes. "No, Steve, no. Clerma didn't tell you this. Of course he didn't. Not this part. I had to figure it out for myself. But it's perfectly obvious, isn't it? There were a couple of things even Wagram didn't know about your past. That you worked a season or two with a carny, for example, long enough to learn how to throw knives, as Wagram found out just now. More important, my guess is that you probably got acquainted with some mentalist, well enough acquainted so that you understood the scope of Wagram's plans for me and realized they might work. It was a simple enough idea. Wagram planted the entire pattern of post-hypnotic suggestion with me when I visited him last week, and arranged for you to give me a prearranged signal while I slept, which would set the whole series of commands in motion as a sort of dream in which a voice directed me. But even Wagram wasn't fool enough to believe that a dazed somnambulist could get away with a detailed crime. You had to get there first, didn't you? Last night, when you were sure I was asleep, you went to Hexler's. That's why the window was already open. That's why the lock on the window seat had already been forced. That's why the emeralds were already stolen. And that's why Hexler was already dead when I arrived. You strangled him with his pillow. I merely repeated the gesture with a corpse. That's insane, but it just might have worked, mightn't it? You came back, then gave the prearranged signal which activated Wagram's pattern of suggestion over me. So that I'd retrace your footsteps, leave telltale fingerprints, retain a memory which would later convince me that I'd been guilty of the crime. The rest of it I can figure out too. Wagram expected me to come running to him today with the story, and he'd be very sympathetic, but finally he'd agree to let me go to the police. That's when you'd step in to testify about my inexplicable absence. Everything would come out then, everything except the present whereabouts of the emeralds, which you were already to have concealed, and turn over to Wagram once I was safely incarcerated and the heat was off. It was a doubly perfect crime, wasn't it, Roxy? Only you wanted to make it triply perfect. By crossing up Wagram, taking the emeralds yourself, and making a run for it. Mexico, I suppose. But when I came to Wagram, something I said or did seemed to have aroused his suspicions. Maybe you were supposed to have phoned him, and didn't. Anyway, he figured things out. And he stole my key, gave it to Dugan, sent Dugan to kill you. It was all right if I discovered your body. That would merely implicate me further when Wagram informed the police he had Hexler's killer. Maybe I was to be accused of your death too. In any event, Wagram would get rid of me, of you, and of any suspicion of complicity. Except, of course, that I arrived before Dugan finished the job, and went to Clerma, and came here. I shook my head. Why didn't you just keep on running, Roxy? Why did you come back? She stared into my eyes. To save your life, Steve. Wagram had the gun. In another minute he'd have killed you. I know. Maybe it's true, Steve. Maybe everything you said is true. And maybe there were other things to come. What would you say if I told you that Carl Wagram confided in me? What if I told you that he was in love with me himself? That he offered me a full share in his future? If this experimental venture succeeded, he wasn't going to stop there. He had plans for his patients, Steve, big plans. Don't forget, some of them were wealthy and important, and all of them had influential connections. He could send them back to their homes, control them through his post-hypnotic suggestions and pseudo-memories, and plant observers at their sides too. He'd recruit his own staff of nurses and attendants for the job. And it wasn't murder and robbery he had in mind. There were bigger things. Some of these people of his had access to estates, trust funds, controlling interests in banks, insurance companies. There'd be ways of making millions in the end, without risk or bloodshed involved. I could have shared that, Steve. But instead, when I came here tonight and picked up that scalpel, I killed him. And saved you. Because you knew it was too late then. If he killed me, there'd be an investigation, and both he and you would eventually be implicated. So you got rid of him instead, hoping that I'd take pity on you and let you save your own neck. Don't lie to me, Roxy, not now. She couldn't meet my gaze anymore, and the flush rose to cover the pallor. "All right, Steve. It's true. I thought maybe you'd let me go." I sighed and put the gun in my pocket. "You're a smart girl, Roxy." "Oh, then you mean?" I turned away and faced the desk, staring down at the phone. "I'll give you 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes. Then I'll have to make the call." She didn't say anything and I didn't look at her, but I knew that she'd opened the door and backed out of the room, retracing her steps, running down between the coffin-like rows where the screaming people slept like vampires in their native earth. And I stood there in the soundproofed silence of the room, and my heart beat a requiem, and the watch on my wrist brought me 10 minutes closer to my own death. Then I called the police. It didn't take them long to come, perhaps 5 minutes more, so that it was just 15 minutes in all since Roxy had departed. Only she hadn't departed, and 15 minutes was quite long enough. I should have thought about that a little more. I should have thought about what might have happened when Dr. Wagram died. Dr. Wagram, whose personal control over the psychotic psyches of his patients plunged them into trance, so that they slept in the room beyond. I should have wondered if perhaps that control might end when Wagram's own life ended. And I should have remembered that the rooms were completely and utterly soundproof. But the police came, and they chose to arrive by the entrance on this side of the house, and by the time I told a portion of my story and opened the door through which Roxy had made her escape, it was too late. I could only stare into the room beyond and listen to the screaming people who had awakened when Wagram died, awakened in all their ravening madness, and waited there when Roxy had retreated into their midst. I could only stare at what was still in their midst, there on the floor, what had once been Roxy, and was now only a torn and tattered mass over which the screaming people fought and clawed and bit and tore, and the sound was deafening, so that the captain of detectives had to shout at me as I pushed him away and entered the room. "Don't, man," he cried. "Where do you think you're going? What's the matter with you?" There was only one answer left to me now, of course, and I gave it to him. I opened my mouth, and I began to scream. End of The Screaming People by Robert Bloch. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.